Welcome to the Brightstar Lifestyle Podcast, where we say yes to joy. Brightstar Lifestyle is in the business of improving life, equipping people with knowledge and skills. We specialize in personal development and guide people and organizations through a life-changing journey. Enjoy! A bright hello to you all. Today we are talking to Hennie Swanepoel. He is a narrative therapist and he is a Brightstar facilitator and he's also my husband. Hennie, would you please tell us more about narrative counseling and narrative therapy?
Thank you, my dear wife. It's such a privilege to talk to you and to share some of my viewpoints about narrative therapy. But I think that before speaking about narrative therapy, we must talk about the question, what are narratives? Narratives are the stories we tell about our lives. We experience lots of things, and for some other reason, we select some of these experiences and make them part of our stories. We can compare it with dots all over. And even before we were born, we experienced things. It's like the dots all over. And for some other reason, we select some of these dots and make stories of them. And that's what stories is all about. And the interesting thing about it is that we don't tell everything that we've experienced. Our stories are selective. A writer from Australia, Alice Morgan, she says, the stories we have about our lives are created through linking certain events in particular sequence across a period of time and finding a way of explaining or making sense of them. And she also says we give meanings to our experiences constantly as we live our lives. Our lives are multi-storied. There's so many stories that we tell.
I'm curious because this is very interesting. Is all stories positive?
Sadly, I must say that no, not all stories are positive. Sometimes we get negative, dominant stories in our lives. And it happens when we experience negative things. Bad things comes on our paths. It may be something like a bad self-worth because of what other people told us and what we believed over the time. And it can be bad experiences in the past or what we experience at this moment. Or it can be, I was diagnosed with something bad or whatever. And these experiences influence our stories to be negative. And these negative stories make it very difficult for us to live meaningful lives.
I'm wondering, does the narrative therapy, really help for these negative stories?
Perhaps I must tell you from my point of view how I experience it as a narrative therapist. Narrative therapy is all about creating new positive stories for people to live. As a narrative therapist, I always tell myself that I know absolute nothing about a person or a person's story. The client is the expert. Actually, I'm the expert of certain narrative ways of doing things, narrative therapy ways, but the client is the expert. And therefore, I must ask questions. I must always ask questions from what I hear, and I must never make assumptions. And furthermore, as David Epstein, narrative therapist from New Zealand, says, I must listen not only to a story, but always for a story. I like that. We don't listen just to a story, we're listening for a story. And in the process, there's a few things that I must remember, and it's important things. The first one is that the person's story is a story. It's not the only story. The person's story and my stories are selective. As I said in the beginning when we talked about narratives, it's all about what I experience as a truth at the moment. And the narrative therapist must help a person to discover more positive truths about their lives. And there's so much more to live, so much more stories to live by. The negative story doesn't have to be the heading of my life. The narrative therapy process is a constant process of listening to stories and asking questions. And it's all about listening for things or moments that contradict the person's negative story. It's very interesting that in the beginning, I'm asking questions to learn more about the person's perceptions and the person's experience of reality. And at a stage, I'm swifting my questions in another direction to make the person think different about how he or she looks at reality. A theme that you will often hear when you talk about narrative therapy is unique outcomes. And unique outcomes are those moments in a person's life when the person had power over the problem. Another instance of narrative therapy is to externalize the problem, because so many times people internalize a problem. They will tell you, I am bipolar, or I am depressed. And often I ask the people, but is that really you? That's a diagnosis. It's part of your life. It's a very big part of your life. But let's externalize this diagnosis. There's bipolar, for instance. What is bipolar's influence on your life? But the important question is, what is my influence on bipolar? Because actually I'm much bigger than this diagnosis, and there's so much more of me. And that's where unique outcomes comes in, to listen and to search for those experiences that's not part of the story at this stage, to help the person to realize, I have power over this bipolar, for instance. There were instances in my life where I had the upper hand, and what in my personality and my being helped me to cope with that. So in core, if I can summarize my view of narrative therapy, it's all about empowerment and disempowerment. You disempower the problem and you empower the person. I often draw a circle with a little black dot in it. And I tell the person, that big circle, that's you. And this dot here is the problem. And there's so much more about you than about the problem. And how can we work together to win the problem and create a new story in your life? That's in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. If I can ask you, without exposing anyone, is there maybe an example that you can share with us, with somebody that you were in a therapy with?
Yes, a long time ago, a lady came to see me, and I asked her what the problem was, and she said, I'm a failure. And I asked her, but why do you believe that? And she said, from when I was a little girl, my father and my mother told me, you're a waste, you're a failure, you will do nothing, you won't pass school, you won't even be able to bake a cake. And she started to believe that because that's what people told her, and that's what her life was all about. And I externalized the term failure, and I asked her, tell me about failure. What does failure do? And she said, failure is afraid to come out of the house. And failure is afraid of other people. And then there's a term in narrative therapy they call it deconstruction. And that's looking for things that contradicts the story of the person at that moment. And then I asked her, but how did you as failure how did you do it? To come here to me, you came out of your home, and she started to think about things. And I asked her, but how did you as failure overcome the problem about being afraid of people, and that you came to see me? I'm a stranger. And it was lots of questions like that. And eventually, after a few sessions, she started to believe that she's not a failure. Failure is a little dot in her life, but there's so much more of her to learn. It was so nice to experience that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this with us and giving us some more insight. But also thank you for being a Brightstar facilitator and helping others to understand their stories and what was written into their stories much better. May you have a great day, and may all of you have a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us today. You can visit us at www.brightstarlifestyle.co.za. Keep on shining.